Welcome to the Friends of Work podcast, the podcast about mastering emotional intelligence at work.
Where I get to be a hypocrite and give advice. Recognize that most goals we set are simply a reaction to problems we dislike, and don't do that.
Okay.
Instead, give yourself room to really think about the answer to the question, what do I want? What do I want to create? I'm the leader here. And where do you get an answer to that? Well, it's not from cribbing. It's not looking at that organization and saying, well, they're doing this, I should do this. It's really making it up. And knowing that when you're the leader, when you're leaning into the utter chaos of not seeing what lies ahead, you have the option to make it up. Now, when you make it up, you need to also ground immediate next actions in reality. You need to understand exactly what's going on. What are the financials, what are the attitudes of the people around you, and then work with brass tacks reality to advance the agenda that you have made up.
Welcome to the Friends at Work podcast. I'm your host, Toye. That was Gideon Culman, executive coach at K Street Coaching. Gideon shares a lot of valuable insights into how to improve one's cognitive maturation for career success. Just before I play you our complete conversation, here's a quick announcement. In the coming weeks, the Friends of Work podcast with Toye will be bringing you even more exciting guests and events. To support this podcast and to learn more about our future plans, please go to patreon.com/friendsatwork. That is patreon.com/friendsatwork. Thank you.
My name is Gideon Culman, and I am the founder of K Street Coaching.
Okay, what is K Street Coaching?
K Street Coaching is an executive coaching firm here in the heart of Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to talk to you today about emotional intelligence and all kinds of other really, really fun topics related to work.
Could you give a little background? What did you just get into coaching straight out of school, or how did you get here?
I got into coaching after several years working in international development and recognizing that there were people who were clearly cut out for it, and I would never be one of them. It was a very humbling and long, drawn-out experience, and finally I started looking for alternatives, and someone pointed me to a coach training program. I went and took a look, and I said, wow, this is it, helping people on an individual basis, one-on-one conversations that move their lives forward in ways that they want. I like it, and I jumped right in and haven't looked back.
I found out that you speak a bunch of languages and you've lived in different places. How did that come about?
I have. I started living in different places when I was 9. I was born in Los Angeles and lived there till I was 9, and then my mother got a Fulbright professorship when I was 9. We moved to Germany, and I learned German because that's what you got to do if you're going to be around Germans. And I'll share a particularly unusual story. We had a house exchange. We were going to live in Cologne, and someone who had an apartment in Cologne was going to live in our house in Los Angeles. And long story short, it panned out disastrously, and unbeknownst to us, the person in Los Angeles came back to Cologne when we were gone one weekend, changed the locks on us, and we were homeless one Sunday night after a weekend trip to Amsterdam. And so the only reason we didn't spend the night on the streets is because I remembered where an half Australian friend of mine from school happened to live, and this is 6 weeks into being there. So strangers in a strange land, And that experience stayed with me. And after grad school, I really wanted to be able to turn that experience into a skill of anywhere I go, anywhere in the world, being able to go from 0 to 100 in no time. And I thought, where can I go where I don't know the language, where it'll actually be challenging to learn the language, and where, frankly, if you don't know the language, people aren't going to be too kind to you. And so I picked China. I figured there's no phonetic alphabet that you can...
No connection.
You can, learn in an afternoon. And so off to China I went, and I chose a place geographically in the center of China, Lanzhou. And for the first few days, I didn't speak a word of Chinese. For the first few days, it felt like I was living outside of language until my ears started picking things up, and I was able to communicate with more than just pointing and smiling. And I have a skill of being able to go anywhere in the world and hit the ground running. No, but I've given myself opportunities to experience that. And so if I ever need to do that, and if I ever need to do that with my family, I'm confident that I can.
Nice. So you give yourself an immersion program all by yourself. Like, you're just going to jump in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing, because as an immigrant here to the U.S. and as someone who has learned some of the same skills, to be able to jump into environments where you don't share the same culture, you don't even share the same food, probably share the same language or English, but and being able to connect with people who are outside, I think is one of those skills that that everybody needs to learn at some level, or at least appreciate.
Where'd you immigrate from?
I'm from Nigeria.
Nigeria.
Yeah, so that's of course, Nigerians speak English, right? But you would think,
among other things.
Among other things, yeah. Well, over 200 languages are spoken across Nigeria, and it's a huge language area on the continent of Africa. So you come here and you expect, I watched, seeing these Americans on TV and, blah, blah, blah. And you think, as Americans often do, in thinking about Africa as a monolith, I think Africans, also have this one idea of what America is, and you come in here and you find out that, there are lots of people and lots of understandings over different geographical areas of the country. And yes, you may use the same language, but there are different meanings attached to those to those words.
How do we stack up to the prejudices you had?
All right, so the interviewer becomes the interviewee.
I can stop that.
All right, it's fine, but it's great. I mean, it's a conversation, so let's do it. I see how that works. But so I would answer that question, and we'll get back into this, which is really great. I mean, there are no prejudices, not exactly. Stereotypes maybe have been thrown out of the window. You get with every culture, people talk about culture shock. I talk about culture shock and culture aftershock, where you have the initial engagement with the culture, and then a few years down the line, when you feel like you've adapted,
you think you've got it, and then it comes in waves,
and then some other thing hits you, and you're blindsided, and you're like, I don't think I got that. Things.
Deep breath.
Yeah, deep breath. Yeah. I like that you've traveled around, and I like talking to people like you for the podcast, because you've had to engage with people outside your culture, and somehow you have to talk to people outside your language. You've had to resort, especially with your story from Germany and in China, you've had to resort to connecting with people on a more fundamental level beyond language, where you realize people understand emotions, right? Emotional intelligence actually came to play with the example you gave with China in particular, where you're just like, you said the expression you made was, you gave us like, without smiling and just pointing. After a while, you started picking up the language, right? And so I think every time when we walk into a new organization, even if they speak the same language, they look like us, everybody has their secret language or the syntax of how they operate within that environment. How have you used this skill to adapt, and how do you advise
other people to develop the skill?
Well, I think one of the cool things about what I do for work, and one of the tricky things about what I do for work, not tricky for me, but tricky for people who have to engage with me, is that coaching at its finest is clean of advice. There is none. And so, to come at your question from a different angle, how it's been valuable is not taking for granted that when I'm talking to you, the words that I think you're saying mean what they would mean if I were saying the same words. Understanding that you have a web of meanings that makes up your life, and part of my job is to comprehend that better than most people around you are, so that you actually feel heard. One of the biggest epiphanies for people who have a first coaching session is come away being like, wow, I don't think I've ever been heard that well before, because I'm not busy bombarding you the way would happen in a normal conversation with what I think you should be doing. I can have your best interests at heart, but if I'm forcing my ideas of what you should be doing upon you, you're not going to be hearing that, because you're just bristling against it.
To be heard, that's a very important thing. I'll say this, one of my favorite books is called How to Read a Book, right? It's by
Mortimer
Adler.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm familiar.
You know the book. And he uses of course, I think Stephen Covey also says this, first to understand and then be understood. But Mortimer uses that, he says that we need to understand beyond just the words. What is the meaning encapsulated in the words that another person is using? And when you get the meaning, because words are essentially capsules for meaning, and you could use same words and have different meanings. And I think it's one of those things that I have found a little difficult in America, where I've used same words but I've come out different meaning. And I've also learned, unfortunately, from my experiences and what I see in the media, that it's also not a very tolerant society for you not getting the meanings or not using the right words right there.
Yeah.
And because people are not necessarily trying to understand you, they just want you to say the words that they understand. And so I give an example. I was talking to a friend of mine, and thankfully it was an American friend of mine, and it was American-born friend of mine, I should say. I was talking about someone, I said they were deaf and they were dumb. Now, in America, using the word dumb is very offensive,
It's
right?
loaded.
It's loaded. But where I come from with the English, where there's no hate or meanness behind the word dumb. It means that they could not speak. And so this, my friend kind of like stopped me and was like, did you mean mute? And immediately she said that. I was like, oh, yeah, that's what, because I was sensitive to language use, right? And I was happy that I made that mistake in a place, in a safe setting, because, I've been in situations, I've watched people being crucified for using the wrong words, and nobody tends to, or don't let me use the word nobody. A lot of people don't want to find out what is the context, what did this person mean? One of the most upsetting news to me was when, at the height of this wokeness, in America, where an officer, a man who had not been known to be ever racist, a white person who had been working for over 30 years, used the word niggardly, which is a proper English word, in context, by the way. And because he had the word nigger in it, and white people are not supposed to be able to say anything close to that, he was crucified in the news media, and he had to resign his position. And I'm like, I understand a bit of this country's history and the ongoing racial challenges. I mean, people don't ask me, the police don't ask me if I'm African. They just see a black person behind the wheels or see a black person on the street. And I have been pulled over in situations which have been racial profiling. So I know what it is. But still, I think there's still a balance that we have to have with some of these things. What is the meaning that this person was trying to convey?
Well, to really drill down on the example you gave, you said that one word contained the other. Etymologically, it did not. Homophonously, it did.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we live in a culture where you have to pay attention to all of the resonance inherent in how words sound. And we have a tendency to force others to comply with general meanings and things like that. And if we don't, people's heads get cut off. And,
exactly.
And in the example you cited, it's so charged that people may not want to create outcomes that work best for everyone. They know what they think, and they want to impose their orthodoxy upon others. And getting back to how we got on this, listening for the web of meanings, it offers a foundation of dignity, I think, that most of us aren't intent on creating day in, day out in our conversations and our interactions with others.
This is one of my hopes with this podcast, to try and show that as people, irrespective of color, accent, I don't know, whatever differences, artificial differences we've created as humans, we have a whole lot more in common than we have as differences. And I wish more people would listen, and we hear, but very few of us actually know how to listen. And I'm hoping that our stories, as we share them, help people to actually listen and say, oh, this person may have used XYZ word, but that's not what it meant in context. And context is everything. And nuances, Societal, you just read something on text and you don't get the nuance, or you hear a soundbite. And it's very easy to get people riled up and upset these days. And I'm like, please, let's pump the brakes a bit. There are problems on all sides. As long as you're a human being, you are a walking problem as much as you're a walking solution. Because as long as you're a human being having to interact with another person, there will be points of friction. And it's about how do we make that a smooth situation? And Friends at Work is really about smoothing those frictional points of interaction within the work environment. So I wanted to drill down a little more into your experiences traveling, right?
Okay.
How would you say traveling has influenced your view of life, of people in general, and how you had to interact with people?
Very simply put, if you think that there's one way to do it, you're wrong. The standard way of life in America that you were describing doesn't cut the mustard in other places.
Yeah. I wish more people knew that. Honestly. And I think it's also true, as someone who has lived a bit around the U.S., I lived a bit in the South, and I'm here in the D.C. metro area. The cultures are very different, even though it's the same relatively East Coast. So I did a trip one time from North Carolina to Boston and just stayed in different places and back. And it was the first time I actually saw the differences in accents as you move up, as you go further north.
And as you did that, what did you notice?
Just noticing that the people are different. At least my interaction as a black person and as a black immigrant was very interesting in the sense that the Southerners are very polite in language, but not as friendly. Very polite in language, but not as friendly. The further north I went, the people were a little more, the language was a little closer to their meaning for me. So if they were mean, they were mean. If they were nice, they were nice. So in the South, you had to, and I'm speaking from my experience now, you had to try and figure out what this person or who this person really was. So they could be really polite to you and they could be undermining you at the same time. But the further north, as like you go to like New York, and people are like, kind of tell you they hate you to your face.
They may mean that.
And they may mean that, yeah. You understand? And people could be nice to you, and they may not mean that either. I mean, but still, it was a little closer. Language is a little closer to meaning for me. So that was an experience. And I like how you said that in traveling, there's not just one way of doing whatever you want to do. And can we bring that into the workplace? I'm a new person in this work environment. I'll give an example. I used to work in Charlotte, North Carolina, and for an IT company, but most of the staff there are from Charlotte. And I got a new job in DC, and it's an IT company also, but I find out that I am doing the same things I did in Charlotte, but I'm not getting the same results. How does that work? How do I integrate? How do I get to understand people? And how do I get them to understand me so I can get my job done?
Well, that's a leadership challenge.
Okay.
And I want to maybe step back and define leadership for a little bit and then address the question head on.
Okay.
Leadership is necessary everywhere. It's necessary in every aspect of our lives, and leadership is a big Rorschach kind of word that people read all kinds of things into but have trouble defining. But if you consider for a moment what good leadership is, it's evident in whether people follow you, if people trust you, if they recognize that you're reliable to produce results, if they want to be led by you. That means you're a good leader. And I think the most one-dimensional definition of leadership that I can provide is, just imagine a line. At one end, you've got relationships. At the other end, you've got tasks. If you manage to balance both of those, you've got effective leadership. And as simply as I've outlined that's a lifelong challenge, mastering that.
Yeah.
And it's easy to think of examples of people who are really good and fun to be around, but if they can't get things done, they're ineffective. We can also think of people who know how to get things done, but they're terrors to be around. They're nightmares to work with. And so that's just a one-dimensional definition of leadership: relationship, task, balance. Now, I want to get closer to the scenario you were talking about. By the time that we're grown-ups, there are qualities that we associate with ourselves. We may think of ourselves as smart. We may think of ourselves as easygoing. We may think of ourselves as reserved. We may think of ourselves as go-getters. Other people may have slightly different associations with who we are, but we have traits that are fairly consistent in most situations, and we've developed those because they produce results. Like you said, when you were working in one setting, being a certain way, doing a set of things produced certain results. And so we come to use those traits, those ways of being, as crutches. And sometimes they work, often they work. They work often enough that we rely on them. But I think a big part of where we go wrong, the vast majority of grown-ups goes wrong, is by assuming that because holding back and being reserved in a certain situation works, that it'll work in every situation. So if I'm used to relying on my encyclopedic knowledge in a situation that requires me to be a go-getter, it's not going to work. You showed up in a certain situation that was similar enough to what you'd been used to, where you could rely on one set of characteristics, and it wasn't working there, but you were bringing the same characteristics to bear in that situation. And that is how the vast majority of grown-ups goes through life, and it's ineffective. And so you're going to find books, articles online about how you should be, but what none of those really takes into account is that the alternatives they suggest are not simply better things to do. They reflect cognitive maturation beyond what we were just talking about, beyond misapplying personality traits to a situation. Now, is it possible to catalyze the cognitive maturation, to bring full-grown integrity, to bring team awareness and fostering team play to a situation, decisiveness, vision? It's possible to catalyze that, but I think that most people who talk a blue streak about it don't realize that really there's actual cognitive maturation that we need to catalyze, that we can catalyze. There are certain things that we can do that will speed that process up. But if we look at you in that situation and say, you know what, you should be doing things differently, that's just mean. It's not helpful.
Yeah. And what is the other way I should be doing it?
Exactly. And as soon as you do that, it's that should approach that makes you feel like you're doing something wrong, when in fact there is simply room and opportunity for growth.
And finding what to grow into. So I see what you're saying, and how does a person recognize this? Because I feel like you presented this from...
it feels like hell. That's it.
Because I see you presented this more like, as a coach, in the sense that someone will explain to you what to do, that this is a different environment you're in, but sometimes you are there and you know that, okay, something needs to change, but you can't answer exactly what needs to change and what it needs to change into. How do you go about that?
I'm just going to go and not answer your question for a moment. And spell out the damage that actually happens when that's going on.
Okay.
We hide it. What you see in just about every workplace you can poke your head into is people running up against barriers, thinking they should be doing things differently, not knowing how to do those things differently, and pretending that everything's all right. And so the toll that takes on us, on the organizations that we work in, is we present ourselves as something other than we are. We waste a lot of people's time and money in doing so, and we model that for new people coming in and create a culture of pretense and ineffectiveness.
So productivity goes down?
Well, it's not just that it goes down, it's that we walk into an organization on our first day of work, see it down, and assume that that's how we do things.
Huh. Yeah, that's so true. I could just picture, places I've worked in and places I've heard of where this sort of thing is really prevalent.
And does it need to be this way? Absolutely not. But it requires the people who make decisions in organizations recognizing the toll that it takes on their organizations, and themselves doing the work to upgrade their cognitive operating system and bring everybody else up. And are leaders willing to do this? Some, yes. And the results are staggering.
So, moving this conversation along a little bit to goal setting, right? let me put it within the context of what you just talked about.
Sure.
I'm a business owner. I find this is beginning to happen. What we just talked about is beginning to happen in my organization. I have people who don't fully understand the culture, and there's a pretense and all these other things are beginning to germinate in the system.
And as someone who has gone out of their way to found their own business, I mean, the amount of vulnerability involved in that, can we just acknowledge that it's sick?
Yeah, it is.
And then seeing people come in this haven that you've created, you have a dream that you're out to realize, and they come into this haven that you've created and feel the need to act on pretense, that's heartbreaking.
It is. And so that happens, and you are like, I need to make something, I need to make a difference and set this. What was the word you used? I like how you presented it, this cognitive recognition of what needs to be done and modeling it for the staff, right? So how do you set goals and how do you give guidance and this kind of thing? Because now you're the leader, and I'm moving from strategy to tactic right now and say, so what are the tactics to actually getting this done if you were in this kind of situation?
Recognize, and this is where I get to be a hypocrite and give advice. Recognize that most goals we set are simply a reaction to problems we dislike, and don't do that.
Okay.
Instead, give yourself room to really think about the answer to the question, what do I want? What do I want to create? I'm the leader here. And where do you get an answer to that? Well, it's not from cribbing. It's not looking at that organization and saying, well, they're doing this, I should do this. It's really making it up. And knowing that when you're the leader, when you're leaning into the utter chaos of not seeing what lies ahead, you have the option to make it up. Now, when you make it up, you need to also ground immediate next actions in reality. You need to understand exactly what's going on. What are the financials? What are the attitudes of the people around you? And then work with brass tacks reality to advance the agenda that you have made up.
Make it up, advance the agenda, be grounded.
Grounded in actual reality, not what you think it should be, not what you wish it were.
So let's talk a bit more. Let's get down to your business right now and talk about your coaching. So
sure.
How does one get into your coaching?
Well, you're likely going to find out about it from someone who has been through K Street coaching. I don't spend a lot of time or resources putting billboards up. And I think it's good that way when people have had an opportunity to actually undergo this process where they're not told what to do, where they're forced to deal with themselves by having someone like me say, hey, what do you want? What do you really want? I remember the first time someone asked me that question when I was looking for guidance myself 12-ish years ago, shortly after I'd moved to Washington, D.C. I sat down with everybody I could for coffees and informational interviews, and really what I wanted was someone to tell me what to do and rescue me. And the buck stopped with a woman who said, what do you want? And I don't think anyone had asked me that before because I was busy trying to find out what I should be doing. And everything ground to a halt, and that forced me to really deal with myself. And would that everyone had to deal with themselves and their desires. That is weird, just because most people don't do it. And then have a look at, what you need to do to get there. Have a look at what's in the way, what habits, and we can define habits as unthinking actions, unthinking behavior. What habits get in the way of what I desire? Most of us have a habit of doing what we think we should do, so we're not even thinking about what we actually want, what we would make up if we gave ourselves the room, the time to do it.
Good stuff. So that's what we get if we come to K-Street Coaching. What do you want?
What I love about that is that, when people work with me, I can think of one gentleman who's on his way up the corporate ladder, and he was clear about what he wants. But then there's the dealing with reality. We did a 360, and it dished up some awful news in terms of how unwilling the people he works for, the people who work for him, his peers, are to see him as a trusted leader. That's an eviscerating blow, but for someone who is so intent on moving forward, it forced him to really take a good hard look in the mirror and deal differently with his staff. And I sent him home after one session saying, okay, you're going to have these one-on-ones. Your job is to find something you love about every single one of your employees. 2 weeks later, we meet. He's got a big smile on his face. He's never seen anything like what he's been able to produce by actively going out and caring. And what do I love about my work? The fact that someone in their ambition can come to me wanting to move things forward, and as a result, just make work life better for a whole lot of people.
That's really great. I know you do a podcast also.
I do.
All right. Can you talk a bit more about that podcast as we round off our conversation?
Sure. My podcast is Where Genius Grows. It's a podcast that is driven by curiosity. How do we explore a rapidly changing world? How is the world changing around us? Against that backdrop, how do we find our voice? And what makes society cohere? If that seems far-flung and disparate, it's because it is. And as someone who professionally works with people to create what they want to create, which often involves a lot of making things up, I'm really intent on understanding current reality. And that's why I interview a lot of people that you probably wouldn't associate with each other.
Yeah.
But I've learned a lot that way, and it's given me a really interesting grasp on how the world is evolving around us.
Nice. So where can we get that podcast?
On any podcast app, just go and look up Where Genius Grows. My name is Gideon Culman, and if you find Where Genius Grows with Gideon Culman, subscribe.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can support this podcast by going to patreon.com/Friends at Work. That's patreon.com/Friends at Work. You can also reach me by email at myfriendtoye@gmail.com. My Facebook page is Friends at Work Podcast, and my Twitter handle is at Friends at Work US. Join me next time for another episode of Friends at Work Podcast with Toye. Bye for now.